She had mastered the art of bleeding without staining her gown. 3 years inside Blackthorn Manor had taught Lady Vivian Ashford one brutal truth about marriage to a powerful man. Dignity was not protection. It was a costume. And tonight, beneath the blazing chandeliers of the Crown Prince's birthday banquet, surrounded by the most powerful nobility in the empire, her husband was about to remind the entire kingdom exactly how little she cost him. Stay with me, because the moment that changes everything doesn't arrive the way anyone expects. It never does. Basta, Ma'am. The carriage rolled through the palace gates at precisely 8 in the evening, the iron wheels grinding against wet cobblestone, and Vivian sat with her spine perfectly straight and her gloved hands folded in her lap like a woman rehearsing for a portrait. The November air pressed cold against the carriage windows. Fog had settled over the capital since morning, thick and indifferent, muffling the distant sound of celebration already leaking from the imperial palace's grand entrance. Across from her, Duke Damien Blackthorn said nothing. He had not spoken to her in 4 days. This was not unusual. What was unusual, what she had spent the better part of the afternoon working not to feel, was the faint residue of Celeste Vale's perfume still threaded through his coat. Damien had come home at 3 in the morning, changed in his private chambers, and appeared at the carriage door freshly dressed, as though the previous night had not happened, as though Vivian did not recognize the particular scent of orange blossom and bergamot that clung to the wool of men who visited the woman the capital had taken to calling the Duke's real duchess. Vivian looked at the fog. She was 26 years old. She had pale gray eyes, the kind that registered everything without appearing to react, and dark brown hair she wore in an elaborate, upswept arrangement that her lady's maid Eleanor had taken 90 minutes to construct. She was wearing a gown the color of champagne silk, understated beside the elaborate court fashions other noble women would arrive in tonight, chosen deliberately because Vivian had learned that anything beautiful she wore became something Damien found a way to diminish. She had been 17 when their marriage was arranged. Her father, Lord Reginald Ashford, had considered it an extraordinary opportunity. The Ashford family held a title and a lineage, but their finances had grown precarious, and Duke Blackthorn's estates in the Northern Territories were among the most profitable in the empire. The match was, by every accounting that mattered to men like her father, perfect. Vivian had understood what the marriage was before she entered it. She had not been naive. She had simply believed, with the particular stubbornness of a young woman who had grown up watching her mother conduct herself with iron composure through every difficulty, that if she was loyal, if she was steady, if she conducted herself with enough intelligence and grace, a man like Damien Blackthorn would eventually recognize what he had. 3 years had taught her the specific pain of being wrong about something you built your life on. "You will not speak with Lord Harrington tonight," Damien said without turning from the window. Vivian looked at him. He was handsome in the way that powerful men often were, not because of their features, but because of how they occupied space. Damien was 34, broad-shouldered, with dark eyes and the easy authority of a man who had never once questioned whether a room would rearrange itself to accommodate him. It always had. "Lord Harrington is the Minister of Trade," she said. "He attended our wedding. He's been making overtures to the Caldwell faction. I don't want your association with him giving anyone the wrong impression about where the duchy's loyalties are positioned." He adjusted his cufflinks. "Stay near the duchess's table. Be pleasant. Don't offer opinions." The carriage slowed as they joined the procession of vehicles approaching the palace entrance, each one releasing its occupants into the torchlit spectacle of the empire's nobility assembling in their finest collective performance. "Will Celeste be there tonight?" Vivian said. It was not a question inflected with hurt. She had burned that particular tone out of herself some time ago. It came out measured, informational, the way she might ask about the weather. Damien turned from the window and looked at her with an expression she recognized, the slight narrowing of the eyes that preceded the specific kind of dismissal that was not quite contempt, but was adjacent to it. "Lady Vale received an invitation through the Countess Farron's household," he said, "as did half the court. I have no control over guest lists. Lady Vale." He used her formal address with Vivian as though that was a courtesy, as though the thin performance of propriety in the confines of their carriage meant something. "Of course," Vivian said, and turned back to the window. The palace glittered through the fog like something from a fever dream. 400 candles lit the grand facade, and the sound of the string orchestra had reached them now, drifting through the cold air with something that might have been beauty if Vivian had been someone else arriving under different circumstances. She had loved music once, before music became the backdrop to her humiliation at event after event. Now she heard it the way you heard the ticking of a clock in a room where something unpleasant was about to happen. The banquet hall of the Imperial Palace held 600 guests with room to perform, and the court of Emperor Frederick Sterling performed with extraordinary dedication. Vivian moved through the preliminary reception on Damien's arm with the practiced ease of a woman who had conducted this exact ritual dozens of times, a smile calibrated to warmth without vulnerability, a posture that communicated neither aggression nor defeat, the careful navigation of who to acknowledge and who to allow to acknowledge her first. Social mathematics. She had become very good at it. She saw Celeste Vale within the first 20 minutes. The woman was extraordinary, and Vivian had never been small enough to pretend otherwise, even inside her own mind. Celeste was 30, the widow of a minor baron who had died conveniently young, and she possessed a kind of physical confidence that filled a room without effort. Dark auburn hair, a gown of deep emerald that cost more than most households managed in a year, and the particular laugh of a woman who understood perfectly well that people were watching. She was standing with a cluster of younger noblewomen near the east wall, but her attention was angled toward Damien with the lazy precision of someone who does not need to try. Damien's arm tensed slightly beneath Vivian's hand. That was all. Just a fractional tightening of muscle, gone in an instant, but Vivian felt it the way you feel a change in barometric pressure. Not in your mind, but in your body, somewhere below conscious thought. She released his arm to accept a glass of wine from a passing footman, and by the time she turned back, Damien had already drifted 3 steps away, drawn toward a conversation with Lord Chancellor Blythe that may or may not have been genuine. Lady Marchmont appeared at Vivian's elbow. Helena Marchmont was 52, the wife of the Northern Territory's senior administrator, and she had known Vivian since childhood. She was one of the 3 women at court who spoke to Vivian without the particular careful sympathy that had come to feel like the social equivalent of condolences. "You look," Helena said quietly, accepting her own wine, "extraordinarily calm for someone whose husband has already crossed the room toward his—" "Don't," Vivian said. Helena was silent for a moment. "How are you?" "I am at the Crown Prince's birthday banquet wearing a champagne silk gown, and I have not yet spilled wine on anyone. I am managing. Your father has been asking about you. My father would like reassurance that the Ashford name is not being actively dragged through the capital, which is a reasonable concern given current circumstances." Helena looked at her sideways. "Vivienne." "I'm fine, Helena." She took a sip of the wine. It was good wine. She made a point of noticing that it was good wine. There was a philosophy she had developed over the past 3 years, built out of necessity, constructed from whatever materials were available. She had decided to find the things that were genuinely worth appreciating within whatever space she was given, because the alternative was to lose herself entirely. It was not optimism. It was closer to a survival tactic she refused to call survival, because calling it that meant acknowledging what it was survival from. The good wine was good. The orchestra was playing something structured and lovely. She was wearing a gown she had chosen with care, and her spine was straight, and she was still here. That had to be enough, because it was what she had. The seating arrangement for the banquet placed Vivian at the duchess's table, the collection of married noblewomen whose husbands occupied the primary tables with the men of political significance. This was standard. Vivian had spent 3 years sitting at the duchess's table, and she knew every woman at it and understood the particular complex social atmosphere that governed their interactions. Countess Priya Aldenmore, who had been Vivian's closest friend at court before her husband's appointment to the Southern Territories had taken them away from the capital 2 years ago, was not present tonight. Her absence created a small, empty space that Vivian felt without acknowledging. Lady Thorncroft, who was kind and somewhat oblivious, talked at length about her daughter's upcoming debut. Lady Fenwick, who was neither kind nor oblivious, and who had always watched Vivian with the particular sharp attention of someone waiting for evidence to confirm a hypothesis, said very little. Lady Sinclair, Vivian's age, recently married and not yet acquainted with the specific education that court life delivered to young wives, radiated the bright nervous energy of someone trying to make a good impression on everyone simultaneously. Vivian was kind to Lady Thorncroft's recounting of her daughter's dress fittings. She was courteous to Lady Fenwick's silences. She guided Lady Sinclair through two conversational near disasters with the gentle efficiency of someone redirecting a boat away from rocks. Across the hall, she watched Damien settle into his chair at the primary table between Lord Chancellor Blythe and General Hardwicke, easy and expansive, inhabiting the role of Duke Blackthorn with the comfortable authority of a man who had never once experienced the particular exhaustion of performing composure as a survival requirement. He was charming tonight. He was often charming in public. This was one of the particular ironies of her situation. The man who reduced her to furniture in private was widely considered a compelling figure, sharp-minded and socially gifted, and people who met them together at events like this one assumed the marriage was correct and appropriate because Damien performed well and Vivian performed perfectly, and the performance from the outside looked like a matched pair. Celeste Vale was seated 3 tables away, positioned where Damien could see her without visible effort. By the second course, Vivian had constructed a detailed accounting of the evening's dynamics, not because she wanted to, but because her mind operated this way. She saw systems, she saw patterns, she read rooms with the involuntary precision of someone who had learned early that reading rooms correctly was the margin between dignity and disaster. She saw Damien glance at Celeste's table 4 times during the soup course. She saw Celeste perform a specific type of laughter for the benefit of the man to her right, timed to the moment Damien was watching. She saw Lord Chancellor Blythe notice the exchange with the carefully neutral expression of a man who categorized information without offering commentary. She saw Lady Fenwick watching her watch all of this. Vivian speared a piece of roasted parsnip and put it in her mouth and decided that the parsnip was also well prepared, which was something. The third course arrived. The orchestra transitioned to something with a heavier rhythm, built for dancing, that would follow the meal. Conversation at the Duchess's table became more animated as the wine continued to flow, and Vivian had managed to find a genuine thread of interest in Lady Thorncroft's description of the architectural renovations being done to the Thorncroft country estate when she became aware of a shift in the ambient attention of the room. It was subtle, the kind of thing you had to be paying a particular quality of attention to detect. A slight reorientation of faces at nearby tables, a collective refocusing of social awareness toward a point behind Vivian's left shoulder. She did not turn immediately. She took a breath first. Then she turned. Crown Prince Adrian Sterling had approached the Duchess's table directly, which was not something that happened at events like this. The Crown Prince circulated during receptions. During the banquet itself, he remained at the imperial table and received those who came to him. The protocol was understood by everyone who attended court functions, which was everyone currently seated within 30 feet of where he now stood. He was 29, a year younger than Damien, and he possessed the particular quality of the Sterling family, a physical presence built on restraint rather than force, which made him, paradoxically, more commanding than men who filled more space. Dark blonde hair, sharply observant blue eyes, the formal military coat of imperial charcoal that the Sterling men wore at state functions. He was not smiling in the way people smiled for public consumption. He was looking at their table with something that was actually closer to attention. "Lady Thorncroft," he said, and Helena's description was accurate. He was attentive, his voice carrying the particular quality of someone who said names because they meant them rather than as a social lubricant. "I believe my mother has been wanting to speak with you about the Northern Architectural Guild. She's at the imperial table whenever you're ready." Lady Thorncroft made a sound very close to a small exclamation and rose to her feet. Prince Adrian's gaze moved around the table in brief acknowledgement of each woman, and when it reached Vivian, it stopped. Not dramatically. Not in a way that announced itself to the room. It simply paused. "Duchess Blackthorn," he said, "Your Imperial Highness." She met his eyes with the same quality of composure she brought to everything, neither shrinking nor performing, because she had stopped performing years ago for anyone who was not actually evaluating her survival. "I don't believe we've spoken since the spring exhibition at the Royal Gallery," he said. "You were looking at the Meridian landscapes." She was aware that Lady Fenwick had gone very still. She was aware that half the tables within earshot had registered this exchange. "I remember," she said. "You disagreed with the gallery's decision to place the secondary Meridian work beside the primary." Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, precisely. Recognition, maybe. The secondary piece changed the reading of the primary. They were painted 20 years apart, and placing them together implied a continuity that Meridian himself rejected. He wrote about the distance between his early and later work quite specifically, Vivian said. The gallery's choice felt like a kindness toward the artist that he wouldn't have wanted. The prince was quiet for a moment in a way that was not uncomfortable. You read his letters. They were published in the Aldenmore collection, not widely circulated but available. I found them at the subscription library on Merchants Row 3 years ago. A pause she regretted slightly because it revealed that she had been at a subscription library on Merchants Row rather than acquiring books through the expected channels of a duchess. But she had said it, and she did not take things back. I know the collection, Adrian said, and something in his voice indicated that he did, that this was not a courtesy designed to smooth over her self-revelation, but an actual piece of shared reference, and the specific quality of talking to someone who actually meant what they said landed in Vivian's chest with an almost physical impact because she had stopped expecting it. I hope, he said, that you'll save me a dance later. He moved on. The table reconstituted itself around his absence. Lady Fenwick picked up her wine glass. Lady Sinclair made a very small sound. Vivian put her hands in her lap and looked at the tablecloth for 2 seconds, and then looked up and continued eating her dinner with the composed precision of a woman who was not, on any interior level, composed. She found him again between courses, not by seeking him out, but because the room's flow brought them to the same corner of the entrance gallery where the air was cooler and the noise of 600 people eating slightly muffled. He was speaking with Lord Aldenmore about something she caught only the tail end of, the trade negotiations with the eastern provinces, and he acknowledged her with a brief lift of his chin before concluding his conversation. She was watching a painting on the gallery wall, a large hunting scene from the previous century because it gave her something to look at that wasn't the careful management of other people's attention. The horse in the lower left corner is anatomically incorrect, Adrian said, appearing beside her. The painter apparently never had much patience for references, she said. The trees are also wrong for the region depicted. You've studied it. I've stood near it during 6 different court events because it's in the cooler part of the gallery, and it gave me something to look at. A beat. That was more honest than intended. I prefer honest, he said. Not as a compliment, she noticed. As a statement of fact, slightly weighted, the way you said a thing that had cost you to arrive at. She looked at him briefly. The sounds of the banquet hall reached them in waves. Laughter, the scrape of chairs, the orchestra managing a transitional piece between courses. Someone across the gallery was telling a story that generated sustained appreciation from the group surrounding them. The Meridian letters, Adrian said, looking at the painting. You mentioned the subscription library. She was quiet for a moment, measuring the thing she was about to do. The Blackthorn Library has an excellent collection of political history and military records. It is less strong in the arts. I supplement through the library on Merchants Row. Does the Duke share your interest in the arts? The Duke's interests are robust and varied, she said, and the particular neutrality of her tone said everything it needed to say without saying any of it, which was a skill she had refined to a precision she was not proud of. The Crown Prince was quiet for a moment. You were at the Caldwell Estate exhibition in August, he said. There was a collection of early landscape oils. You were there, she said. She had not known he was there. Briefly, I saw you in the second gallery. You were standing in front of the harness piece for almost 20 minutes. It was the only painting in the collection that wasn't performing for the viewer, she said. Everything else was trying very hard to make an impression. What was the harness piece doing? She thought about it. Existing, she said. Just very precisely existing. Like it didn't need you to notice it, but it was glad you did. A pause. The length of it was not awkward. That was remarkable. The length of it was not awkward, which Vivian registered with a quality of attention she reserved for genuinely unusual things. I should return to the table, she said. Lady Sinclair is navigating her first major court event, and she has a tendency to overcommit to conversations she can't gracefully exit. You're managing her. Someone should. She paused. She's 22 and she's trying very hard. I remember what that felt like. He looked at her then with something she couldn't categorize and didn't try to. The dance, he said. Later. I'll find you. She inclined her head and moved back toward the banquet hall, and she kept her face exactly as it always was, composed, attentive, appropriate, and she did not let herself feel the thing pressing at the inside of her ribs until she was seated and the next course had arrived. And she had a glass of wine in her hand, and the Duchess's table's conversation had resumed, and no one was watching her specifically. Then she let herself feel it for approximately 3 seconds. It was not hope. She was too experienced now for hope. It was something smaller and more precise. The specific relief of being seen by someone who appeared to be looking at her actual face rather than the surface she maintained for the room's consumption. It was the relief of a single genuine sentence in an evening constructed entirely of performance. She put the feeling away. She had learned to put things away. It was one of her most useful skills. The dancing began at 10. The banquet tables were cleared with imperial efficiency. The orchestra elevated its register to something built for movement, and the hall became a different animal, more fluid, more charged, the formal geometry of seated dinners dissolving into the more complex social mathematics of the floor. Vivienne danced twice with Lord Harrington, whom Damien had told her to avoid, but who sought her out specifically to discuss the Northern River trade agreements in a way that was clearly part of whatever political positioning was happening between his faction and the duchy. She was gracious and informative and said nothing that committed her to anything. She danced once with Lord Aldenmore, who was 60, and asked about her family's estates in the West with genuine warmth. She was asked twice by younger men she didn't know well, and accepted once, because the balance of accept and decline was itself a form of communication at events like this. Damien danced with Lady Ellsworth, the minister's wife, for the first set, obligation and politics. She understood this. For the second set, Damien danced with Celeste Vale. The floor did not stop. People continued moving, the music continued, conversations at the perimeter continued in their orbits. But the particular quality of social awareness shifted in the way it always did when a man chose to make something publicly visible that everyone had agreed to pretend was invisible. It was not a sharp collective intake of breath. It was subtler. A dozen small adjustments, a recalibration of who was watching what, the fine mechanism of court attention orienting itself. Vivienne was standing near the east wall when it happened. She was speaking with Helena Marchmont, who placed one hand on her arm with a pressure that said, "I see this, and I am here." And Vivienne looked at Helena's hand for one moment, and then looked back at the conversation and said something about the architectural renovations, which Helena continued because she understood what was needed. She did not watch them dance. She was aware of them. That was different from watching. She was aware of them the way you were aware of a wound, not by looking at it, but by the specific quality of the awareness. And then someone stepped into her field of vision. Crown Prince Adrian Sterling offered her his hand. Around them, the room, the particular organism of 600 people that had been watching the Duke of Blackthorn dance with his mistress, and the Duchess of Blackthorn not watch, experienced another one of those collective recalibrations, sharper this time, more pronounced, because what was happening now was not ordinary. The future emperor of the realm was asking a neglected duchess to dance, while her husband danced with his mistress 10 feet away. Vivienne looked at Adrian's offered hand for exactly 1 second. His expression was even, not apologetic, not performing anything for the audience. There was a quality to it she found later she could only describe as deliberate, not impulsive, not theatrical, but chosen, the face of a man who had decided to do this specific thing. She put her hand in his. He was an excellent dancer, of course he was. He had been trained since childhood for this exact theater, and he led with a quiet authority that required no force. They moved into the floor, and the space around them opened the way space opened for him because it always did. "I should tell you," she said very quietly, when they had been moving for several bars, "that this will be talked about." "It's already being talked about," he said. "It was being talked about when you entered the banquet hall. You know that." "Yes," she said. "Then we're talking over people who are already talking. Nothing's changed." She looked at him, at the careful attention of his face, at the fact that he was looking back at her and not at the room, or at her husband, or at the calculation of how this played, but at her. "Why?" she said. One word. He was quiet for 2 bars. "Because you were looking at a painting of incorrect horses for 20 minutes in August because it was the only thing in the room that wasn't performing," he said. "And because you've been standing inside your own composure all evening, like a woman waiting for a building to stop falling on her, and it seemed like someone should—" A pause. "Offer a different room." Vivienne was quiet for a moment that she needed. That's a considerable thing to say on a dance floor, she said finally. I know, he said. I mean it exactly as much as it sounds like I mean it. They danced, the orchestra played, the 600 people in the hall watched with the particular quality of attention that the court brought to events that would be discussed for months. And across the floor, through the gaps between other dancers, Vivian caught one fractional glance of her husband's face. Damien Blackthorne, Duke of the Northern Territories, the man who had told her not to offer opinions tonight. And she saw something she had never once seen in 3 years of marriage. She saw him watching her, not with indifference, not with the casual authority of a man certain of his ownership. He was watching the crown prince's hand at the small of her back, and the quality of the exchange between them, and something was moving behind his eyes that Vivian, who had spent 3 years learning to read the room her husband occupied, did not immediately recognize. Then she did. It was miscalculation. The sudden, sickened awareness of a man who had operated on a set of assumptions for so long he had never thought to question them, watching those assumptions develop a fracture line in real time. She looked away first. Back to the prince's face. Back to the music. Back to the particular and completely new quality of the present moment, which was different. It was different in a way she was not yet equipped to assess. It was different in a way she had been trained by 3 years of increasingly careful management not to trust. But it was different. And then the music stopped, and the footman appeared at the edge of the floor with his formal silver tray and the sealed envelope upon it, and he approached not the imperial table, not the Duke of Blackthorne's aide, but Prince Adrian directly. And something in the footman's posture said this was not protocol but urgency, and the prince took the letter and read it standing on the dance floor with Vivian's hand still resting on his arm. She felt the shift in him before she saw it on his face. The quality of his stillness changed. Something closed and something opened simultaneously behind his eyes. And when he looked up at her, his expression was still composed, but it was composed over the top of something that had not been there 30 seconds ago. I need to ask you something, he said. And I need you to answer it honestly because what's written here concerns you directly. Vivian looked at him. Her heart was doing something that had nothing to do with the dance and everything to do with the quality of his voice and the weight of the sealed letter in his hand. What is it? She said. How much? He said. Do you know about the agreement your husband signed with the Eastern Mining Consortium 6 weeks ago? The world seemed to contract. Her spine went very still. Nothing, she said. I know nothing about it. The prince looked at her with an expression she would spend a very long time afterward trying to accurately name. Then someone, he said quietly, has been working very hard to make sure of that. And what this letter contains suggests that you are the one person in this entire palace tonight who has the most reason to know and the most to lose from not knowing. And I think, he said, his voice dropping lower, meant only for her, that you have been kept uninformed with considerable and deliberate intent. The orchestra had begun again. Around them, the floor was filling. Damien was somewhere behind her watching, and 600 people were watching, and the fog was still thick outside the palace windows. And Vivian Ashford, who had spent 3 years surviving what she thought was the worst thing her marriage could deliver, understood in the space between one heartbeat and the next that she had been wrong. She had not yet seen the worst. She had not seen any of it. The letter was still in the prince's hand. Vivian could see its edge, the seal broken, the paper slightly thicker than standard correspondence, the kind used by imperial administrative offices when what they were communicating was not meant to be informal. She had developed, over years of managing a household she was allowed to manage only in the ways Damien found convenient, a precise eye for the weight of official documents. This one was heavy with something. She could read that without reading a single word of it. You said I have the most to lose, she said. Her voice came out level. She was aware this was a small miracle. Tell me what it says. The orchestra was covering their conversation from every direction. Adrian held the letter at his side, and his body language, the particular way he had angled himself so that his back was partially toward the room, created a pocket of privacy in the middle of 600 witnesses. He had done this deliberately. That, also, she noted. 6 weeks ago, he said, your husband filed a petition for marital dissolution with the Imperial Court of Records. The grounds cited are irreconcilable temperamental incompatibility. A pause, brief and clean, giving her time to receive that without rushing past it. The petition also includes a formal reassignment of all Ashford-connected estate holdings that passed to the duchy through your marriage contract. The legal language argues those holdings were assets of the duchy, not personal property. Vivienne did not move. That's not what the marriage contract specifies, she said. No, it isn't. He was watching her carefully, not with pity. She would have withdrawn from pity with the speed of a hand pulled from fire, but with the attention of someone who understood that what they were saying was landing on a person who needed accurate information and had the capacity to use it. The petition has not been formally accepted yet. There's a review period, but it was filed, and this letter is from a clerk in the records office who is, he hesitated fractionally, known to my household. He thought someone should be aware. Aware, she said, before it becomes public record. The room around them breathed and laughed and danced. Celeste Vale was somewhere behind Vivienne's left shoulder. Damien Blackthorne was somewhere behind her right. The candles were very bright. Vivienne had the thought, clear, cold, arriving with the specific character of something that had always been true but had just been confirmed, that her husband had never at any point in 3 years been confused about what she was to him. He had not drifted from respect to indifference. He had entered the marriage knowing exactly how he intended to exit it, and the intervening 3 years had been, for him, a waiting period, a management problem, a logistics concern to be resolved when the timing was correct. She had not been a wife who failed. She had been a holding position. My family's estates, she said, the Ashford Western property. Included in the reassignment claim. Her father, Lord Reginald Ashford, who was 63 and whose health had been declining for 2 years, and who had believed, with the desperate faith of a man who had run out of other options, that his daughter's marriage to the Duke of Blackthorne had secured the family's future. She breathed in through her nose very slowly, feeling the bottom of it, and out. How long, she said, do I have before the review period closes? 40 days from the filing date. The petition was filed 31 days ago. 9 days. Thank you, she said, and she meant it with a precision that had nothing to do with courtesy, for telling me. She stepped back, put a small and appropriate distance between them, and when she turned to navigate back through the dancing floor, her face was exactly what it always was. She found the far wall. She found a column to stand near. She put one hand, very lightly, against the cool stone of it, and she let the information settle through her body the way you had to let things settle before you could figure out what to do with them. 9 days. Damien was on the floor now, moving through the social mathematics of the evening with his characteristic ease, and she watched him from the column's shadow, and she felt the specific reconfiguration of understanding that happens when you finally see the actual shape of something you've been living inside. It wasn't rage. Rage would come later, maybe, or maybe it wouldn't. She had been managing her own interior weather for long enough that she was not certain she still had access to clean, uncomplicated rage. What she felt was closer to the sensation of a room coming into focus. The proportions had been wrong for 3 years, and now they were correct, and the correctness was devastating in its clarity. He had been stripping the duchy's influence from her systematically, one administrative reassignment at a time. She had read that as indifference. It had been preparation. She thought about Celeste Vale with new geometry. Not a rival. A replacement, positioned and ready, waiting for the legal machinery to complete its work. She thought about her father's face the last time she had seen him, in September, when he had asked carefully about the duchy's northern expansion, and she had told him carefully that things were progressing, and he had nodded with the relief of a man who needed that answer to be true. She pushed off the column and walked toward the powder room with the smooth, unhurried movement of a woman who needed to refresh her appearance, and she closed the door behind her, and she stood at the mirror with both hands flat on the vanity table, and she looked at herself. The woman in the mirror looked back. Pale gray eyes, dark hair, a champagne silk gown she had chosen because anything beautiful became a target. 3 years of practiced composure sitting on a face that was younger than it felt from the inside. She had 9 days. She had, potentially, a crown prince who had deliberately sought her out on a dance floor at the precise moment she needed someone to do exactly that. She did not know what that meant yet. She did not trust what she did not know, but she was also not going to discard an available resource because it arrived in an unexpected form. She had the 40-day review period, which meant the petition was not yet final, which meant there was a window. She had, although Damien did not appear to know this, Spent 3 years at subscription libraries on Merchants Row reading everything she could find on imperial property law, Northern Duchy administrative records, and historical precedents for marital dissolution cases involving contested estate holdings. She had done this because her mind needed something to do that was not managing pain. She had done it the way you filled a container so it could not be filled with something else. She had not known, specifically, that she would need it for this. She understood now that some part of her had always been preparing for something, and that the something was this. She came back out of the powder room with her face correct and her spine straight, and she moved through the edge of the ball looking for Helena Marchmont. Helena was near the supper table speaking with Lady Aldenmore, and she registered Vivian's approach with the specific alertness of a woman who had been watching the room for the past 20 minutes. "Walk with me," Vivian said. They moved toward the gallery. "The Meridian painting," Vivian said when they were clear of the primary crowd, keeping her voice conversational, her face arranged for anyone watching to read as two women discussing something pleasant. "The subscription library collection. Do you know if the Aldenmore Legal Archive is still accessible through the library's reference system?" Helena looked at her. "Vivian, what happened?" "I need access to the imperial filing records from the last 40 days, specifically any petitions logged with the Court of Records." A beat. Helena was not slow. She was also not going to ask what she suspected in the middle of a gallery with people moving through it. "The Aldenmore Archive requires a sponsor from a registered noble household," Helena said. "My husband's name is on the registration. Can you get me access in the next 48 hours? "Yes." No hesitation. "My husband's secretary can arrange it. I'll tell him it's for estate research." A pause. "Is it estate research?" In a manner of speaking, Vivian looked at the painting with the incorrect horses. "Helena, if it comes to it, if there is a public proceeding, a formal dissolution hearing, I need someone who will stand with me who is not my father." "I will stand with you," Helena said, and she said it the way people said things they meant, flat and simple and without decoration, and Vivian felt something loosen fractionally in her chest that she had not known was clenched. "Thank you," she said. "What did the prince say to you on the floor?" Vivian was quiet for a moment. "He told me something I needed to know. Half the room thinks he's infatuated with you. Half the room is constructing a narrative from insufficient data." She paused. "The other half may be closer." Helena looked at her sideways. "I don't know what he is," Vivian said, honestly. "I know what he did, and I know that it was deliberate, and I know that a crown prince who acts with deliberation in public does not do so without understanding exactly what he is doing." She touched the frame of the painting lightly. "Right now what matters is what I do in the next 9 days. 9 days, Helena said. "Tell me tomorrow about the archive access." She moved back toward the hall before Helena could respond, stepping back into the light and noise of the imperial banquet with the equanimity of a woman arriving somewhere she had chosen to be stuck at. Damien found her at 11:30 between the final dancing set and the supper service, in the way that men found women they had been ignoring all evening when they suddenly required their presence. He appeared at her elbow with a glass of wine he was not offering her, and the specific quality of attention she had not felt from him in months. Focused, evaluating, with something working behind his eyes. "You danced with the prince," he said. "He asked," she said. "Declining would have been a significant breach of protocol." "Don't explain protocol to me." "I'm not explaining protocol. I'm explaining that I made the appropriate choice given the circumstances." She turned to face him fully, which she had learned was more effective than profile. People who avoided direct confrontation were easier to dismiss. "Was there something you needed?" He studied her. She let him study her. She had learned to make her face a room he could not read the contents of. "You looked," he said, "comfortable." "I was having a conversation." "You looked comfortable," he repeated, and the repetition had an edge to it, the edge of a man identifying something that does not fit the model he has been operating on and finding the misfit irritating rather than interesting. "You looked like a woman who had somewhere to be." She held his gaze. "I've always had somewhere to be," she said. "You simply never asked." Something moved across his face. Not remorse, not guilt. The specific expression of a man recalculating, which was different from either of those things. He was looking at her with the narrowed attention of someone who has picked up an object they have been carrying for years and suddenly noticed it has changed weight, She thought, "You filed a petition 31 days ago. You have been building toward this for 3 years. You have been deciding, methodically and privately, what my life would look like after you were finished with it, and you did not at any point consider that I might have a perspective on the matter." She said, "The supper service is beginning. I'm going to find Lady Sinclair." She walked away from him, and she did not look back, and the specific quality of not looking back was different than it had been every other time she had walked away from Damien Blackthorne. Every other time it had been survival. It had been the management of a wound. It had been putting one foot in front of the other inside a life she had accepted as the shape of things. This time it was a choice about what came next. She crossed the hall toward Lady Sinclair's location, and she let herself, very briefly and completely privately, feel the cold, clean shape of what she now knew. Not the pain of it, which was real and large and would need to be dealt with. Not the fear of what it meant for her father, not any of the weight of it, but just the specific clarifying quality of finally holding the correct map of the territory she had been navigating blind. She had been navigating blind for 3 years. She was done with that. Lady Sinclair saw her coming, and her face opened with relief. And Vivian arrived at her side and placed one hand on her arm and said something light about the supper menu, and the young woman exhaled and began talking, and Vivian listened with the quality of attention she brought to everything, full, accurate, present. And across the hall, her husband watched her from a distance that was the same as it had always been, and was now, for the first time, a distance she had chosen. The fog outside had not lifted. The candles were burning lower. The Empire's nobility ate their supper and talked about everything except what they were thinking about, which was the particular exchange that had happened on the dancing floor earlier, and what it meant, and what came next. Vivian ate her supper. She tasted it. At the door of the palace, 3 hours later, when the carriages were being brought around and the evening was formally ending, Adrian Sterling passed within speaking distance of her in the crowd of departing guests. He did not stop. But he turned his head as he passed and met her eyes for 1 second, and in that second his expression said, with the clarity of a man who chose his communications precisely, "This is not finished." She inclined her head a fraction. Then the crowd shifted and he was gone, and Damien was at her elbow with his coat, and the carriages were waiting. In the carriage home, Damien sat across from her and looked out the window at the fog. Vivian looked at the fog on her side. The wheels ground against the wet cobblestones. The night had the specific quality of a held breath. Then Damien said, without turning from the window, "What did he say to you?" "The Crown Prince?" She kept her voice even. "We discussed the Meridian exhibit from the Royal Gallery. He has considered views on the placement of the secondary work." A long silence. The carriage moved through the dark. "Vivian," Damien said, and something in his voice was different from anything she had heard from him in 3 years. Not softer, not apologetic, but carrying the particular weight of a man who has just encountered the edge of something he had not mapped. "Don't do anything foolish," she said. He looked at her. She looked back at him across the dark carriage, with the fog moving past the windows, and 3 years of managed composure sitting in her body like a language she had learned in a country she was finally leaving. "I never have," she said. The horses moved through the fog. The city passed. Damien said nothing more, and the silence between them was different from every silence that had preceded it. Not the silence of indifference, but the silence of two people who are now, for the first time, actually paying attention to each other, and finding in that attention something that cannot be put back the way it was. The carriage reached Blackthorne Manor at midnight. Vivian went directly to her chambers. Not because she was tired. She was not tired. She was running on something colder and more precise than wakefulness. But because the chambers were where her writing desk was, and the writing desk was where she kept the locked correspondence drawer, and the locked correspondence drawer was where she had been storing, for the past 14 months, every document she had quietly accumulated about the duchy's administrative structure. She had not known what she was building. That was what she understood now, removing her gloves in the lamplight while Eleanor unhooked the back of the champagne gown with practiced efficiency. She had assembled the pieces without a clear picture of what they assembled into, the way you collect materials against a winter you can feel coming but cannot yet see on the horizon. The winter had arrived. She dismissed Eleanor. She sat at the desk in her dressing gown, and she opened the drawer, and she laid out what she had. 14 months of careful, unannounced attention. Copies of duchy correspondence she had managed to read before the administrative secretary, on Damien's instruction, had rerouted all official mail away from her. Records of estate holdings from the Imperial Property Registry, accessed through the subscription library's reference system under the pretense of historical research. Her own marriage contract, which she had read so many times she could recite its relevant clauses without looking, and which specified in language that a competent legal mind would find defensible, that the Ashford Western properties transferred to the marriage, not the duchy. That distinction mattered. That distinction was, potentially, everything. She worked until 3 in the morning. When she finally stopped, she had a clear accounting of what she had and what she needed. And the gap between those two things was navigable if she moved in the next 72 hours. She slept 4 hours. She woke before dawn with her mind already working. Beta. Helena's message arrived at 9 the following morning. The Aldenmore archive access was arranged. 2 o'clock. The reference room on the 3rd floor of the subscription library on Merchants Row. Come as yourself, Helena had written, because coming as anyone else requires a paperwork trail neither of us wants. Vivian was there at 10 minutes before 2. The reference room was quiet, occupied by 2 scholars working in focused silence at separate tables. The Aldenmore archive occupied a series of locked cabinets along the north wall, and the library's senior archivist, a man of 60 with the careful neutrality of someone who had spent his career being discreet with information, unlocked the relevant sections and withdrew. She had 2 hours. She used all of them. What she found in this first 40 minutes confirmed what the prince had told her. The petition for dissolution was filed, dated, and bearing Damien's seal. The legal language was as described: irreconcilable temperamental incompatibility, the least specific and therefore hardest to contest ground available under imperial marital law. The estate reassignment claim was attached as a supplementary filing, 3 dense pages of property law argumentation that she read twice and then read again. The argument was sophisticated. She would give Damien's legal counsel that. They had constructed a case for the Ashford Western properties being duchy assets based on a secondary clause in the original marriage contract that she had never had reason to examine closely, a clause about the administration of properties brought into the marriage through noble alliances, which a skilled reading could interpret either way depending on how much weight you gave to the surrounding language. A skilled reading, the operative phrase. She needed someone who read imperial property law the way she read it, not as a formality, but as a living structure with pressure points and gaps. She wrote down everything she needed, and she was back in the carriage by 4. At 4:30, Vivian's lady's maid Eleanor appeared in the study doorway with an expression that said she had been instructed to deliver something and had opinions about being placed in the position of delivering it. A letter, my lady. It was delivered to the servant's entrance. Not the main entrance. Vivian registered this. From? There's no sender marked. She took it. The paper was standard quality. The handwriting was unfamiliar and had the compressed precision of someone who had learned to write while caring about not being identified by their writing. She broke the plain seal. It said, "The petition is not the whole of it. There is a secondary arrangement your husband made with the Eastern Mining Consortium that assigns extraction rights to Ashford-adjacent territories in exchange for consortium financing of the dissolution legal costs. The arrangement predates the petition by 4 months. If this reaches the imperial court before the review closes, it ends the petition entirely. The document exists. It is currently in Lord Chancellor Blythe's administrative archive. Someone there wants it found. No signature." Vivian read it twice. Then she held it over the lamp until it caught and burned it in the fireplace grate. Someone there wants it found. Someone in Lord Chancellor Blythe's office, which meant someone who knew what was in that archive, which meant someone with access, which meant this was information being actively fed to her by a party she could not identify, for purposes she could not fully assess. She sat with that uncertainty for the length of time it took to burn, which was long enough to make a decision. She did not have the luxury of waiting for clean information. She had 7 days now. Clean information was not on offer. She sent a note to Helena Marchmont that evening. The note asked a single question, phrased as an inquiry about a mutual acquaintance, which Helena would understand as it was meant. The question was, does Lord Aldenmore have a working relationship with anyone in Blythe's office? Helena's reply arrived before dinner. Lord Aldenmore's Trade Committee had overlapping jurisdiction with Blythe's Eastern Territories portfolio. There was a man named Carver who sat on both committees, a mid-level administrative secretary who had been in the Imperial service for 12 years and who Helena described as meticulous and privately dissatisfied. Meticulous and privately dissatisfied. The exact profile of someone who kept careful records and had reasons to want those records seen. She was composing her next step when Damien came home. She heard him on the stairs, his particular footfall, the weight of it, the way it paused outside her study door before continuing to his own chambers. She had heard that pause hundreds of times. She had always read it as indifference, as the habitual geography of a man navigating a house he did not particularly share with her. She understood now that she had been misreading it. The pause was not indifference. It was assessment. He had been assessing her, each time, the way you assessed a variable in a calculation you were running. She kept working. 1. 3 days later, Vivian sat across from Carver in a tea room on the western edge of the merchant quarter, arranged through a chain of intermediaries she had constructed with the particular care of someone who understood that what she was doing had to be invisible. Carver was 44, slight, with the eyes of a man who had spent 12 years watching other people make decisions and had strong and unvoiced opinions about most of them. He drank his tea without pretense. He looked at her without performance. "You understand," he said, "that if this comes back to me, I lose my position." "I understand that," she said. "And you understand that I am telling you this not because of any," he searched for the word, "sentiment about your situation." "Then why?" she said. He turned his cup in its saucer. "Because what Blackthorne did with the consortium filing is not legal under Imperial Charter, and Chancellor Blythe knows it and is letting it stand because Blackthorne's northern trade routes are worth more to Imperial revenue than one duchess's property claim." A flat pause. "I have been watching things that are not legal be let to stand for 12 years. This one is documented well enough to be stopped." She looked at him across the table and felt the specific quality of a man who had reached the end of something and was choosing, finally, the version of himself he could live inside. "What do I need to do?" she said. He told her. She memorized it. She did not write it down. She thanked him in the way that people thank each other in a tea room, and she left, and she walked 3 blocks before she let herself process the full shape of what he had given her. It was enough. If she could get it to the right desk at the Imperial Court before the review period closed, it was enough to invalidate the secondary filing and contest the primary petition on the grounds of the consortium arrangement. Because under Imperial Charter, using external financial arrangements to fund a dissolution proceeding created a conflict that voided the petition's legal standing. She had 4 days. She was halfway back to the manor when the carriage stopped. Not gradually. Sharply, the horses pulling with the reluctant energy of animals being overridden, and she heard the driver's voice, a short sound of surprise cut off. And then the carriage door opened and Lord Chancellor Blythe stepped in. He was 61, broad, with the patient face of a man who had been navigating imperial politics for 30 years and had long since stopped finding them surprising. He sat across from her, and he pulled the carriage door shut behind him, and he looked at her with an expression that was not hostile and not friendly, and was precisely neither on purpose. "Duchess Blackthorne," he said. "Lord Chancellor," she said, "you've been busy." She held his gaze. "I've been visiting the subscription library on Merchant's Row. I have a long-standing arrangement there." "And the tea room on Weaver Street." She said nothing. The carriage was stopped. The street outside was quiet, residential, not a location she recognized. "I'm going to tell you something," Blythe said, "and I'm going to tell you once, and I would like you to hear it clearly." He laced his fingers together in his lap. "What you're doing is not unknown to people who have the capacity to stop it. The question of whether they choose to stop it is a different question, and the answer to that question depends on how you proceed from this moment. You're telling me I've been watched. I'm telling you that the Emperor is aware of the consortium arrangement and is not pleased with its implications because the arrangement compromises the Imperial Charter's administrative integrity in a way that creates precedent he doesn't want. The petition and everything attached to it is, from the Emperor's perspective, a problem. She sat with this for exactly the time it needed. Then why hasn't the Emperor acted? Because acting requires a formal complaint lodged at the Imperial Court by an aggrieved party with legal standing to file it. He looked at her evenly. You have 4 days and you have legal standing. The question of whether you survive the social consequences of using it is a separate matter. What are the social consequences? Your husband will contest it publicly. He has allies and resources, and he will use both. The consortium has significant capital invested in the outcome. And, a pause that carried weight, Lady Vale's connection to the Eastern trading families gives the consortium access to communication channels that could make this very unpleasant for your family. Her father. Again, her father, the pressure point, the place where the architecture of her resistance was most vulnerable. How unpleasant, she said. The Ashford family's Western estate debt, which exists and which your husband is aware of, could be called in through secondary instruments if the consortium chose to move against it. Vivian's hands were folded in her lap. She felt the cold move through her from somewhere below rational thought, that specific physical response to understanding that the ground you thought was solid is not solid, that the calculation you thought was complete had a variable you had not accounted for. Her father had debts. She had known this abstractly. She had not known the specific exposure. She had not known Damien knew. Of course Damien knew. He had known before he married her. She thought about the 17-year-old girl who had entered this marriage believing that loyalty and composure were sufficient protection. She thought about her with a grief that was not self-pity, but something more precise. The grief of understanding exactly how much had been decided about you before you were ever in the room to have a say. And then she put the grief down. If I file, she said, and I survive the contest and the petition is voided, what protection does the filing itself provide against the consortium moving on the estate debt? Blythe looked at her, and in his expression she read something she had not expected, a fractional, carefully neutral respect. A formal complaint filed at the Imperial Court creates a period of administrative stay on all related financial instruments, he said. During the stay, no secondary debt instruments can be called against parties named in the complaint, including family members. She did not breathe for 2 seconds. How long is the stay? 90 days from filing. 90 days. Long enough to find another way. Long enough to move her father's exposure to ground that the consortium could not reach. Then I file, she said. Blythe nodded once. He reached into his coat and produced a document she recognized as an official Imperial Court filing form, pre-stamped with the court's administrative seal. Carver prepared this 2 weeks ago, he said. He has been waiting for someone with standing to sign it. She stared at the document, at the pre-stamped seal, at the implication of 2 weeks. You orchestrated this, she said. I am the Lord Chancellor of the Imperial Court, he said. I do not orchestrate. Position available remedies. She looked at him, at the careful structure of a man who had been running a very long game in a place where long games were the only ones worth playing. She thought about the anonymous letter delivered to her servant's entrance. She thought about Helena's information arriving with such precision. And the Crown Prince, she said, the letter at the banquet. Blythe said nothing, which was its own answer. She had not found the window. The window had been built around her, and she had been walked toward it by people with interests she did not yet fully understand, toward a filing she was about to make with a document that had been prepared before she knew she needed it. The question of whether that changed what she was about to do was, she decided in the space of one breath, not the right question. The right question was whether the outcome was genuinely hers, whether the choice in front of her was real, whether the filing was something she was choosing or something she was being used to accomplish. She looked at the document. She looked at Blythe. What does the Crown Prince want from this? She said. The Lord Chancellor's expression shifted by a fraction. Not surprise. He did not appear to do surprise, but something that acknowledged the precision of the question. That, he said, is something you should ask him. She picked up the document. She signed it, and the carriage door opened onto a street she didn't recognize, in a city that had just become an entirely different place, and the woman who stepped out of it was the same woman who had stepped in. Same face, same gown, same spine, and also nothing like her because the woman who stepped in had believed, on some level she had not examined, that she was making a plan, and the woman who stepped out understood that the plan had been made around her, and that she had just made herself its instrument without knowing whose instrument she was. 4 days left, a signed document in Blythe's hands, and somewhere in the Imperial Palace, a Crown Prince who had danced with her and told her she had somewhere to be, who had sent her information through a network she had not known existed, who wanted something from this that the Lord Chancellor had declined to name. She had signed the document. She had no idea anymore whose story she was in. She had 3 days left, and she spent the first of them doing nothing that looked like anything. This was intentional. She had signed the document and handed it, in effect, to a man whose game she did not fully understand, and the worst thing she could do now was move visibly while she was still mapping the board. So she went home. She had dinner with Damien in the formal dining room, which happened twice a week by household protocol, regardless of whether either of them wanted it, and she ate her food and answered his questions about the Northern Estate's upcoming seasonal accounts, with the correct level of informed deference. And she watched him across the table and she thought, "You do not know about Blythe. You do not know the document is signed. You believe you have 3 days and a filing that is still yours to stop." She let him believe it. Damien was not a stupid man. This was something she had never allowed herself to forget, even at the lowest points of their marriage, because forgetting it would have meant underestimating him, and underestimating him would have been fatal to whatever small room she had managed to carve out for herself. He was smart, and he was strategic, and he had been running a very long and methodical plan with her at its center, without her knowledge, which required both intelligence and a specific kind of coldness. The ability to look at a person daily, to share a table and a household and occasionally a conversation that bordered on genuine, and to be calculating their disposal the entire time. She understood now that the coldness was not personal. That was the most clarifying and in some ways most brutal realization of the past 4 days. It was not that Damien hated her or had been injured by her or was punishing her for some specific failure. She had simply been a resource, assessed and allocated, and now being reallocated with the same emotional register he brought to the duchy's quarterly land management reviews. She was acreage. She was a line item. You could survive hatred. You could understand it, push against it, find its shape, and work around it. The indifference of pure calculation was something different. It left you with nothing to engage, no injury to address, no version of yourself that could have done better. There was no amount of grace or intelligence or composure that changed the mathematics. She ate her dinner. On the second day, she received a message from Crown Prince Adrian Sterling. It arrived through legitimate channels, a formal imperial courier, sealed with the Sterling household crest, delivered to the main entrance of Blackthorn Manor before noon. The existence of the message was therefore known to the household staff, to Damien's secretary who logged incoming correspondence, and by extension to Damien himself within the hour. This, she understood, was also deliberate. The message was brief and impeccable in its propriety. His Imperial Highness wished to convey his appreciation for the Duchess of Blackthorn's conversation at the recent banquet. He had located, in the Imperial Library's holdings, a copy of the Aldenmore correspondence collection, including the Meridian letters they had discussed, and would be pleased to offer the volume for her perusal should she wish to collect it at the palace's East Library at her convenience. He remained, etc. She read it at the writing desk with the late morning light coming through the window, and she understood every layer of it. The message was proper. The message was also a declaration, aimed not at her, but at anyone watching, that the Crown Prince of the Empire maintained an interest in this particular duchess, an interest framed in the most socially irreproachable terms available, which made it impossible to challenge directly and impossible to ignore. He was building a visible record. She was being publicly associated with the Sterling household through official correspondence before the filing became known. She thought about asking him what he wanted from this. She thought about the fact that she had signed the document without having asked, and that the time for that question was now inside a context she had already agreed to. She sent a formal reply accepting the invitation for the following afternoon. Then she sat at the desk for a long moment, and she allowed herself to feel the full shape of her situation, which she had been managing in pieces and needed to hold all at once. She had no allies she fully understood. She had a document she had signed in a carriage on a street she didn't recognize. She had a father whose financial exposure could be used against her. She had a husband who had been planning her disposal for longer than she had been planning her survival, which meant he had a structural advantage she could not entirely overcome. She had a crown prince who had been feeding her information through a Lord Chancellor who had been constructing her legal rescue before she knew she needed rescuing. What she had that none of them had accounted for, she thought, was that she was the only person in this arrangement with nothing left to protect except the truth. Damien was protecting assets. Blythe was protecting Imperial Charter. Adrian was protecting something she hadn't named yet. The consortium was protecting investment. Everyone was protecting something that could be threatened, leveraged, compromised. She had already lost everything she'd thought she had. The marriage, the position, the 3 years of careful performance that had been directed at a man who was never going to see it. The version of herself that had believed composure was protection. That woman was already gone. What remained was just her actual self, stripped of the performance, and a set of facts that were documentably true. People without anything left to lose were not reckless. That was the myth. What they actually were was precise. The fear that softened your edges was gone. What remained was just the question of what was actually true and what needed to be done about it. She knew what was true. She arrived at the palace's East Library at 2 in the afternoon the following day. Adrian was already there. He was standing at the window with the light behind him, still in the dark coat of his household rather than the formal imperial dress, and when she entered, he did not perform the elaborate welcome of a man receiving a social call. He looked at her with the direct attention she had come to associate with him, the quality of actually looking, which was rarer than it should have been among people with power. "You signed it," he said. "I did. Blythe told me." He moved away from the window and picked up the volume from the reading table. The Meridian letters, actually present, the physical embodiment of the cover this meeting required. He placed it in her hands and she took it. "He also told me you asked what I want from this." "You declined to answer through him. Some conversations need to happen directly." He gestured toward the chairs and they both sat, the table between them, the East Library's high shelves surrounding them with the particular quiet of rooms that held a great deal of old paper. "What do you think I want from it?" "Three options present themselves," she said. "First, you have a genuine political interest in destabilizing the consortium's hold on the northern trade routes, and I am a useful instrument for the filing that accomplishes that. Second, you have a personal interest in me that you are pursuing through the available mechanisms, and the political utility is secondary. Third, both are true simultaneously, and you are not separating them because you don't need to." He was quiet for a moment. "Which do you think it is?" "I think it's the third," she said. "And I think the reason you arranged the dance and the letter and the Blythe conversation rather than simply approaching me directly is that you were testing whether I was capable of acting independently inside a constructed situation, whether I was someone worth the risk." Something moved across his face. Not discomfort, the expression of a person confronted with an accurate description of themselves. "That's not entirely fair to you," he said. "It's entirely accurate. Fairness is a separate question." She set the Meridian volume on the table between them. "What happens after the filing?" "The petition is voided. The estate reassignment fails. Your father's exposure is protected under the administrative stay." He met her eyes steadily. "And your marriage is formally under review by the imperial court, which means Damien cannot refile for a period of 2 years without imperial sanction." 2 years. "During which time the political landscape of the northern territories will have changed considerably." A pause. "During which time other arrangements can be formalized." She looked at him across the table, at the careful structure of what he was offering, which was real and which she believed he meant, and which was also, indisputably, something he had constructed with the same deliberate intelligence he brought to everything else. "I need you to understand something," she said. "I signed the document because it was the right action given the facts available to me, not because of what comes after. If what comes after doesn't happen, if the political landscape changes and the arrangements don't formalize, the document stands on its own and I stand on my own. I am not," she chose the word with precision, "contingent." The silence that followed was 3 seconds long. "I know," he said, and then, "That's why." She held his gaze and understood that this was the real answer to her question, the one he hadn't given Blythe to deliver. The why was not the political utility, and it was not the arranged mechanisms, and it was not any of the calculated positioning. The why was a woman in a subscription library on Merchant's Row reading letters about a painter who painted things that just existed, precisely, without needing anyone to notice them. She was not going to let herself be moved by that right now. She was going to file it in the same drawer where she had put the 3-second feeling on the dance floor, the drawer she kept for things that were real but could not be used yet. "The filing process is tomorrow morning," she said. "What does Damien know?" "As of this morning, nothing. Blythe's office runs a closed intake." He paused. "He'll know by noon." She was home by 4. She went to her study and she organized everything she needed, organized and she wrote a letter to her father that did not explain everything because everything was too large and too fast, but told him, with the precision of a daughter who had learned her composure from watching him hold himself together through years of difficulty, that certain arrangements were being resolved, that the Western estate was protected, and that she was well. She sealed it and sent it with the household courier. She had dinner alone. Damien was not home. At 9:30 in the evening, she heard the main entrance of Blackthorn Manor open with a force that the household staff did not use. She heard his footsteps on the marble of the entrance hall, not the measured weight of a man navigating his own house, but something faster, harder, the footstep of a man who has received information and has not yet decided what to do with the physical energy it generated. She heard him speak to someone, clipped and sharp, a name she didn't catch. She heard the study door on the ground floor open. She heard it close. She put her pen down. She stood. She straightened the front of her dress with a single downward movement of both hands. She looked at herself in the dark window's reflection for 1 second, the woman who had nothing left to lose, who had signed the document, who had made herself her own instrument and no one else's. And she walked to her study door and she opened it and she went downstairs. The ground floor study's light was visible under the door. She opened it without knocking. Damien was standing at the window with his back to her. He had his coat still on, which meant he had come directly here from wherever he had received the information. His left hand was at his side, closed. His right hand held a document she recognized even from across the room as an imperial court notification, the acknowledgement of filing, the stamp of the court of records, the formal language of a process set in motion. He heard her come in. He didn't turn immediately. When he did, his face was not what she expected. She had prepared for rage, for the cold authority of a man who had been outmaneuvered and was restructuring into attack. What she saw instead was something more primary and in some ways more dangerous. He looked like a man who had been walking in a direction for a very long time and had just run out of ground. "You filed," he said. "I did. With Blythe's office." "The Imperial Court of Records." "Yes." He looked at her. The document in his hand and the space between them, and 3 years of a marriage that had been, she now understood completely, a calculation from its first day. "The consortium arrangement," he said. "How long have you known?" "Long enough." "That's not an answer. It's the answer I have." She stood in the center of the room, and she did not go toward him, and she did not retreat from him, and she kept her voice at the register of a woman who had made her decisions and was standing in them. "The filing protects the Ashford estate from the consortium's secondary instruments. You knew about my father's exposure." Something moved across his face. Not quite guilt. The acknowledgement of a specific fact being named aloud that he had preferred to keep in the category of unspoken leverage. "The consortium would not have moved on the estate debt," he said. "You don't know that, and you were going to use the possibility of it to prevent me from contesting." She kept her voice even. "That's not a question. I'm telling you what happened." He looked at her with an expression she had no prior category for because she had never seen it on his face. The expression of a man being accurately described to himself by someone he had significantly underestimated, and understanding in real time what that underestimation had cost him. "The prince," he said. His voice had gone quiet, the particular quiet of something constrained. "The Crown Prince had information relevant to my legal situation and communicated it." "Don't!" His voice sharpened. "Don't use that tone with me. Not about that." "Which tone would you prefer?" she said. "I have several available." It landed. She watched it land. 3 years ago, she would not have said it. 2 weeks ago, she would not have said it. She said it now because the woman who had curated every word for minimum damage had left the building on a street she didn't recognize, and what remained said true things. Damien crossed the room in 3 steps, and she held her ground, and he stopped 2 feet from her, and they were close enough that she could see the specific quality of his agitation. The tight jaw, the controlled breathing, the eyes that were doing something complicated and loud, and entirely internal. "The consortium will not let this stand," he said. "You've made enemies that Blythe's filing protection doesn't cover past 90 days. "I know that." "The North doesn't forgive." "I know that too." She looked up at him from 2 feet away, and she felt the truth of the ground she was standing on, which was narrow and real and hers. "I know everything that comes next is hard and uncertain and expensive. I knew that when I signed it. I signed it anyway." A pause. You spent 3 years deciding what my life would look like after you were finished with it, and you never once considered that I might have a perspective on the matter. You never asked. You never looked. Her voice stayed level throughout, which cost her something she didn't show. That's what you actually lost. Not the petition, not the consortium arrangement. You lost 3 years of actually knowing the person standing in front of you, and you spent it on a calculation instead. The silence in the room had a physical weight. Damien's face in the lamplight was the face of a man arriving somewhere he had not mapped, standing in terrain that had no prior chart, and understanding for the first time with his full intelligence what he had been doing and what it had made him. He said nothing. She turned to go. "Vivienne." His voice stopped her at the door. Not a command, the sound of a man who had run out of commands. "The Winter Royal Assembly is in 4 days. The court will know about the filing by then. Every noble family in the Empire will be in that room." She turned back. She looked at him across the study, at the lamp, at the imperial notification still in his hand, at the 3 years of furniture between them. "I know," she said. "He'll be there. I know. And you'll go." It was not a question. He was not asking her not to go. He was identifying, with the clarity of a man who had finally started looking at the actual shape of things, what was about to happen. The Winter Royal Assembly, the full court of the Empire, the filing now public record, the Crown Prince's visible interest now established through official correspondence. Every power that had been operating in the shadows of the past 4 days about to be forced into the open by the unavoidable architecture of a state event that no one with a title could absent themselves from. "Yes," she said, "I'll go." She walked out of the study and up the stairs and into her chambers, and she closed the door, and she stood in the center of the room, and she breathed. 4 days. The Winter Royal Assembly, where every debt and alliance and calculation of the past 3 years would have to wear its actual face in a room with nowhere to hide. And the woman who had spent those 3 years as furniture was going to walk in with a filing at the imperial court and the Crown Prince's Book of Meridian letters on her writing desk and absolutely nothing left to perform for anyone. She thought about what Damien had looked like standing in the lamplight with the court notification in his hand. She thought about Blythe's careful, constructed patience, about Carver and 12 years of watching things be let to stand, about an anonymous letter burned in her grate, about the second gallery of the Caldwell estate, and a painting that just existed, precisely, and didn't need you to notice it. She thought about what Adrian had said across a library table that afternoon. That's why. 4 days to a room full of Empire's sharpest and most dangerous minds, every one of them recalculating their position based on information that was now 48 hours old and changing by the hour, and somewhere in that room Damien Blackthorne was going to have to make a choice about what kind of man he was willing to be in public, when the private version of himself had been made completely visible. She did not know what he would choose. That, she realized, was the thing she could not calculate. Not the consortium, not the court, not the Sterling household's long game. Damien. The man she had shared a table with for 3 years and a household and a name. The man she had been wrong about in the specific way that only happens when you build a life on a misreading. What he would do when he had no more moves in a room full of witnesses and the woman he had underestimated standing 12 feet away from the future king. She did not sleep for a long time. When she did, she dreamed of a painting with incorrect horses, just existing in a quiet room, needing nothing, glad of whoever came to stand in front of it. Outside, the winter pressed against the manor's windows, and the Empire held its breath, and 4 days collapsed toward one. The Winter Royal Assembly convened on a Thursday. The Empire dressed for it the way the Empire dressed for everything that mattered, with the particular precision of people who understood that appearance was not vanity, but language, that what you wore to a room told the room what you had decided about yourself before you opened your mouth. Vivienne chose a gown the color of deep winter blue, not champagne, not anything designed to minimize. She had spent 3 years choosing clothes that would not become targets. She was done with that mathematics. Eleanor dressed her hair without being asked to make it simpler. She made it exactly what it was. Damien was already in the entrance hall when she came downstairs. He was in his formal duke's coat, dark and correct, and he looked at her when she descended with an expression she had not seen from him in 3 years and could not immediately name. Not assessment, not the habitual calculation, Something quieter and more damaged, the face of a man who had spent 4 days in a house with the full weight of his own choices and had arrived somewhere on the other side of that reckoning that he had not previously visited. He said nothing. She said nothing. They entered the carriage and rode to the imperial palace in the particular silence of two people who have said everything that needed to be said and are now simply waiting for the world to catch up with the conversation. The Winter Royal Assembly's ballroom held 800. Every titled family in the empire sent representation. The chandelier arrangement alone required 40 servants 3 days to complete, and the effect, when you entered, was of standing inside something that had decided to be magnificent, regardless of what happened beneath it. Vivienne walked in on no one's arm. She had not planned this as a statement. She had simply, at the carriage door, not taken Damien's arm when it was offered, and he had not pressed the point, and they had separated at the entrance with the quiet efficiency of two people who no longer needed to perform their marriage for the room because the room already knew. The room already knew. That was the first thing she felt when she entered. The quality of attention, the slight collective reorientation of 800 people who had all read the same court filing notification in the past 48 hours and had been waiting to see what it looked like in person. It was not hostile. It was not sympathetic. It was the raw attention of people for whom power arrangements were the primary weather system of their lives, watching a new configuration settle into place and calibrating accordingly. She moved through it the way she moved through everything. Spine straight, eyes level. The composure that had started as performance and had become, through 3 years of necessity, simply how she was built. Helena found her within 10 minutes. "You look like a woman who has decided something," Helena said. "I've decided several things," Vivienne said, "most of them in the last 4 days. The court is buzzing. The consortium sent 2 representatives and they've been in conversation with Lord Harrington since the doors opened." Helena kept her voice conversational, her face arranged for the room. "Blythe is at the imperial table. He hasn't looked at Damien once. He won't. He doesn't need to." Vivienne accepted a glass of wine from a passing footman. "Where is the prince?" "Imperial table. He arrived early." A pause. "He's been watching the door." She let that settle and then let it go. There were other things to manage first. She spent the first hour of the assembly conducting herself exactly as she had conducted herself at every court event for 3 years, with the one difference that she no longer had any reason to manage anyone's impression of her marriage. This turned out to free up a remarkable amount of cognitive space. She spoke with Lord Aldenmore about the northern trade routes with the directness of someone who had been reading the relevant documents for 14 months and no longer had reason to conceal that she had. She spoke with Lady Sinclair, who had heard everything and was visibly uncertain how to behave, and she made it easy for her by behaving normally, because Lady Sinclair had done nothing wrong, and the cost of court events falling apart for young women trying to find their footing was real, and Vivienne had not forgotten what that felt like. She spoke with 2 members of the consortium's legal representation, which surprised them, and she was precise and cordial, and gave them nothing, and took from the conversation a clear understanding of exactly how exposed their secondary filing position was now that Blythe had accepted the complaint. They knew it too. She could see it in the careful quality of their courtesy. Men who have lost a legal position are polite in a specific way, the politeness of people buying time while they find another angle. She did not think they had another angle. At the second hour, the formal assembly convened. 800 people found their places. The imperial family entered to the appropriate acknowledgement. Emperor Frederick Sterling, 71 and still carrying the weight of his office with the particular solidity of a man who had occupied authority long enough that it had become structural, took his seat at the head of the imperial table. Crown Prince Adrian sat to his right. He met her eyes once, across the full width of the room, with the direct attention she had learned to receive without flinching. It lasted 2 seconds and communicated nothing that could be read by anyone watching except that 2 people who knew each other had acknowledged each other's presence. It was correct. It was also, beneath its correctness, something else entirely, and she filed it in the drawer she kept for things that were real and needed time. Damien was 3 tables away. He was talking to General Hardwick with the surface ease of a man who had not spent 4 days inside his own demolition. She watched him for 10 seconds and then stopped watching him because she had made her decision about how much of her attention Damien Blackthorne was entitled to going forward, and the answer was not this. It happened at the third hour, between the formal address and the dancing. Lord Chancellor Blythe rose from the imperial table to deliver the administrative announcements that preceded every winter assembly. Appointments, territorial adjustments, formal acknowledgments of petitions received and processed. It was procedural. It was always procedural. People talked through it quietly, refreshed their wine, used it as cover for conversations they needed to have. The room began to settle into that familiar pattern, and then Blythe read the item that ended all other conversations. He read it in the language of Imperial Administrative Record, clean and procedural. The Imperial Court of Records had received and accepted a formal complaint against a dissolution petition filed by the Duke of Blackthorn on grounds of chartered impropriety in the petition's financial arrangements. The complaint had been filed by the Duchess of Blackthorn. The petition was suspended pending review. All related asset reassignment filings were frozen under administrative stay. The ballroom did not gasp. 800 people with titles did not gasp at things. What happened was the particular quality of collective recalibration that Vivienne had been feeling in rooms her entire adult life. The subtle shift of weight, the reorientation of attention, the moment when the thing that everyone has been waiting to become official becomes official, and the entire organism of the court begins adjusting to the new reality. Into that silence, while it was still the specific silence of 3 seconds after a significant announcement, Duke Damien Blackthorn stood up. Vivienne saw it happen. She watched him rise from his chair at the primary table with the deliberate movement of a man who had made a decision and was now executing it, and she felt her pulse do something sharp and quick that she did not let reach her face. He did not look at Blythe. He looked across the room directly at her. "My wife," he said, and his voice carried with the easy authority of a man who had spoken in large rooms his entire life, "is the most capable person I have failed to see clearly for 3 years." The room was very still. The petition was mine, and the calculation behind it was mine, and the estimation of what she was and what she was worth that produced that calculation, that was mine too. He was not performing. That was the thing that held the room. He was not performing the way people performed public acknowledgments, with the careful architecture of managed impression. He was just speaking, with the flat specificity of a man who had decided that the truth was the only currency he had left. I treated her as a position to be managed, rather than a person to be known, and I did it for 3 years with enough deliberateness that she had to become a different kind of woman than she should have had to become, just to survive the marriage I was supposed to be her partner in. Vivienne's hands were still in her lap. Her face was what it always was, but it cost her more than it usually cost her, because she had not expected this. And she did not know what to do with it yet, and the room was full, and 800 people were watching her receive it. "I'm not asking for anything," Damien said. This isn't that. He stopped. He looked at the tablecloth for 1 second, which was the most human thing she had seen him do in 3 years. I wanted to say it where she could hear it, and so could everyone else. Because she's been carrying things in front of this court for 3 years that weren't hers to carry, and I put them on her, and the least I can do is take them back in the same room. He sat down. The silence lasted another 2 seconds. Then the room's organism resumed its movement, conversations restarting in a dozen registers simultaneously, the court absorbing this new data and processing it with the relentless efficiency of people for whom information was oxygen. Vivienne looked at the tablecloth in front of her. Helena's hand found her arm under the table and pressed once, briefly, and withdrew. She breathed in. She breathed out. She thought about the 17-year-old girl who had entered a marriage believing that grace and loyalty were sufficient armor. She thought about the woman who had stood in a carriage on an unknown street and signed a document and stepped back out into a city that had become a different place. She thought about 3 years of subscription libraries and incorrect horses, and a drawer full of feelings she had been saving for when there was time. She did not cry. She had not cried in front of a court event in 3 years, and she was not going to start now. But she sat with the weight of what had just happened, the specific and irreversible quality of a public truth. And she let it be as heavy as it actually was, because she had been managing the weight of things for long enough that she knew the difference between weight you carried and weight you needed to set down. This was weight she could set down. She found Damien at the edge of the gallery an hour later, in the cooler air near the hunting scene with the incorrect horses, because apparently this was where she came when things happened. He was standing with a glass he hadn't been drinking from, looking at nothing in particular, and he turned when he heard her come. Up close, in the quieter light of the gallery, his face looked like a man who had walked out the other side of something and was taking inventory of what he'd brought with him. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know. It doesn't change the filing." "I know that too." He looked at the painting. "I didn't do it to change the filing." She stood beside him, and they both looked at the anatomically incorrect horse in the lower left corner, and the room behind them continued its breathing, and she thought about what 3 years actually cost, the specific currency of it, the things you spent that you did not get back. "What are you going to do?" she said. "About the duchy." He was quiet for a moment. "The consortium will withdraw their financing now that the secondary filing is frozen. The northern expansion slows down. I'll spend the next year managing a territory with reduced capital and a reputation that needs rebuilding from the ground up." A pause. "It's survivable. I made the situation and I'll work inside it." And Celeste, something moved across his face. Not guilt, precisely. The honest accounting of a man who had made a series of choices that had felt like freedom at the time and were now visible as what they actually were. "She left," he said. 2 days ago, when the filing became public record. Vivian had known this was probable. She felt it anyway, the specific sadness of a fact confirming itself, not because of what it meant about Celeste and Damien, but because of what it said about the economy of people who orbit power without having any of their own. Celeste had not been a villain. She had been a woman who made her own calculations in a world that offered women like her a narrow set of options, and she had chosen the one that looked most like safety. And when the safety dissolved, she had moved on with the efficiency of someone who had always known it might. There was nothing to hate in that. There was just the particular sadness of a situation that had ground up everyone in it with complete indifference. "I'm sorry," Vivian said. And she meant it, because she had stopped performing emotions 3 years ago, and she did not say things she didn't mean. Damien looked at her. The expression on his face was one she had never seen, and would probably not see again. The face of a man receiving unexpected grace from someone he had not given any reason to extend it, and not knowing what to do with it because he had not built himself a room for that experience. "You don't owe me that," he said. "I know. I mean it anyway." She turned to face him. "I'm not going to tell you what to do with the next part of your life. That's yours. But I'll tell you what I think, since we're here and you told the truth in front of 800 people, and that deserves something honest back." She paused. "You're smarter than you used this marriage. You're capable of more than what you built here. The man who stood up in that room just now is closer to what you could be than the man who filed a dissolution petition without telling his wife. Those 2 men are both you, and you get to decide going forward which one you're building." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside the gallery windows, the winter dark had settled completely, the city invisible behind it. "Will you be all right?" he said, quietly, sincerely, in the way that sincerity sounds when it is new to a voice. "Yes," she said, and that was also entirely true. She crossed back through the ballroom, and she was 2 steps from the east door when Adrian fell into step beside her with the unhurried ease of a man who had been waiting for a moment to arrive without forcing it. "Walk with me," he said. They went through the east door and into the corridor beyond, where the sounds of the assembly softened to a manageable distance. He did not take her arm, and she did not offer it, and they walked side by side through the corridor with the particular ease of people who had stopped performing for each other some time ago. "He spoke," Adrian said. "He did. I didn't anticipate that." "Neither did I." She looked at the corridor ahead of them. "I've been thinking about what you said in the library, about why." "Have you?" "I've also been thinking about the fact that I signed a document in a carriage on a street I didn't recognize, inside a situation that had been constructed around me with considerable precision, and that I still don't fully understand whose interests that construction served." He was quiet for a step. 2 steps. "Mine," he said, "and yours, and the Empire's, which is not the same thing as any one person's interests, but contains them. Those 3 things were all true simultaneously, and I didn't separate them because I didn't need to, and because—" He stopped walking. She stopped with him. "Because I spent 6 months watching you move through court events with the quality of attention of someone who was reading every room they were in and doing it alone. And I kept thinking that whatever that intelligence was being spent on was not what it should be spent on. That felt like waste on a scale that bothered me. He looked at her. That's a cold way to say it. It's an accurate way to say it. I prefer accurate. She met his eyes. And the other part? The other part, he said, is that I looked for you at every court event for 6 months before I said a word to you. And every time I found you looking at something that no one else in the room had noticed, and I wanted to know what you were seeing. A pause. That's the part that isn't political. She held his gaze in the quiet corridor, with the assembly's distant sound around them, and the winter outside, and the full weight of everything that had happened in the past 4 days settling into its actual proportions. I need time, she said, not as a performance of reluctance. Actually, I have been someone's instrument, deliberately or otherwise, for a long time, and I need time to be my own instrument before I become anything else to anyone. I know, he said. I'm not asking for now. I'm telling you what's true so you have accurate information. You prefer accurate. A fractional smile, the first genuine one she had felt on her face in longer than she could precisely account for. I do. Then accurately, I will wait. And I will not construct anything around you while I'm waiting. You'll have the space. He paused. And when you're ready, if you're ready, you come and tell me what you've decided. Not because I've positioned you there, because you chose it. She breathed in the quiet corridor air, and she felt the specific quality of a moment that was real, not managed, not performed, not the product of a calculation she was standing inside without knowing it. Just two people standing in a corridor saying true things to each other. All right, she said. 3 months later, Vivian Ashford stood in the West Gallery of the subscription library on Merchants Row, in front of a small oil painting that had been donated to the library's permanent collection by an anonymous patron sometime in the previous year. It was a landscape, quiet, technically unfussy, depicting a stretch of open ground in late afternoon light, the kind of painting that did not announce itself, that required you to stand with it for a while before it gave you what it had. She had been standing with it for 12 minutes. The administrative stay on her father's estate was holding. Lord Reginald Ashford had traveled to the capital twice in the past 2 months, and the color had come back to his face, and he had stopped asking careful questions about the duchy's arrangements because the duchy's arrangements were no longer his concern. He had looked at his daughter across his dining room table 3 weeks ago and said, simply, that she seemed like herself, and she had understood that this was the most specific and most generous thing he knew how to say. The dissolution proceeding was moving through the imperial court at the pace of imperial proceedings, which was slow and correct and unalterable. Damien had not contested it. He was managing the duchy's northern territories with the reduced consortium financing and the rebuilt reputation his public statement had started, and by every account she still heard court accounts, she was still a duchess until the proceeding completed, he was doing it without the particular coldness that had characterized his management before. Whether that change was permanent, she had no way of knowing. She thought it might be. She thought some transformations were real and some were performed, and the difference was visible if you paid the right quality of attention. She had been paying attention to herself for 3 months. This was harder than paying attention to rooms full of other people. The rooms full of other people had always been, she understood now, partly a place to put her intelligence so she did not have to turn it fully inward. Inward was harder. Inward meant sitting with the specific weight of 3 years and what they had cost and what she had learned and what she had become inside them. Not a triumphant reckoning, nothing so clean as that, but the slow and unglamorous work of understanding yourself after a period of extended survival. She had been reading. The subscription library had become something different to her now that it was no longer a place she came to secretly. She had a full arrangement, her own account, her own corner table on Thursday afternoons. She had been reading about imperial property law and history, and also, in the evenings, the Meridian letters again, which she found she needed to read differently now that she was not reading them as something to hold on to in a life she was enduring. She was reading them as pleasure. She was still learning what that felt like. She had written to Adrian twice. He had written back 3 times. The correspondence was exactly what he had promised. Nothing constructed, nothing positioned, just 2 people saying what was true to each other with the particular economy of people who had discovered they preferred accurate to comfortable. She had told him about the Thursday afternoons. He had told her that the Imperial Library had acquired a second collection of early landscape correspondence that she might find interesting. She had not yet gone to look at it. She thought she would go soon. The painting in front of her had been there for a year, the library's small placard said, donated by a patron who had not wished to be identified. She stood with it for 3 more minutes, and then she thought about what she knew of a crown prince who had watched her look at a painting in an empty gallery for 20 minutes before he said a single word to her, and she allowed herself to simply feel the warmth of that thought without putting it away in a drawer for later. She did not need the drawer anymore. The afternoon light in the library was good. Outside, the capital moved through its winter with the indifferent vitality of a city that had absorbed this and every other story into its permanent fabric. And the empire continued its enormous turning. And somewhere in the imperial palace there was a man who was waiting with the patience of someone who had decided to mean what he said. She was not the woman who had entered a carriage 3 months ago with her hands folded in her lap and her spine straight and her silence trained to a precision that had nothing to do with choice. She was not the woman who had spent 3 years bleeding without staining her gown. She was not the woman who had filed away every genuine feeling until the drawer was so full it had stopped closing. She was just Vivienne. What that meant, the full dimension of it, she was still finding out. That was not a loss. That was what living felt like when you finally had room for it. She turned from the painting. She put on her coat. She walked out of the library into the winter afternoon, and the city opened around her, cold and particular and real, and she walked into it without managing her face for anyone. And it was, in its modest and unglamorous and entirely genuine way, the beginning of something she had not let herself believe in for a long time, something that was simply hers.